Jerome Hadley was not a man who left things unfinished. 38 years as a master electrician had taught him one unshakable rule: every wire has a purpose, and when the current stops flowing, something somewhere has gone wrong. You trace the line, you find the break, you fix it before the whole system goes dark. For 19 years, his marriage to Sabrina had been the steadiest current in his life, but for the past 11 months, that current had gone dead. No more hand on his back when she passed behind his chair. No more singing while she cooked. She had stopped answering her phone when he called from job sites, stopped meeting his eyes across the dinner table, started sleeping in the guest room with the door locked, and when he asked why, she said the same thing every time. "I just need space, Jerome." That was all. No fight, no explanation. Just a woman slowly, deliberately, removing herself from every room he was in. Tonight, Jerome Hadley sat in his truck in the driveway of their home in Lithonia, Georgia, with a manila envelope on the passenger seat. Inside it, a separation agreement. His attorney had drawn it up that afternoon. All he needed was to walk inside and set it on the kitchen counter. He had rehearsed the words. "Sabrina, I love you, but I can't keep living next to a stranger." He turned off the engine, sat in the quiet for a moment. Then he noticed the front door was slightly open, not wide, just enough to let the evening air drift through the screen, and through it, carried on the warm May breeze, he heard his wife's voice. Not the measured, careful voice she had been using with him for nearly a year. This one was raw, unsteady, the voice of someone who had stopped pretending. "Lorraine, I got the second opinion today." A pause. Sabrina's oldest sister, Lorraine, lived in Macon. Jerome had noticed the call logs. Lorraine's number appearing 3-4 times a day. He had told himself it was family gossip. He had told himself a lot of things. "It's lupus, Lorraine. Systemic. The rheumatologist confirmed it. My kidneys are already showing involvement." Another pause, longer. "No. Jerome doesn't know. He can't know. Not after what happened with his mother. You remember what watching her deteriorate did to him. He was 23 years old and it broke something in him that never fully healed. I will not be the woman who puts that look back on his face. I would rather lose him to distance than lose him to watching me fall apart." The manila envelope made a soft crinkling sound as Jerome's hand tightened around it. The separation agreement he had been carrying like a verdict. The 11 months of silence he had interpreted as rejection, as contempt, as the slow, unmistakable withdrawal of a woman preparing to leave. All of it collapsed in a single breath. She had not been pulling away because she stopped loving him. She had been pulling away because she loved him so completely that she had decided to carry a devastating diagnosis entirely alone rather than risk breaking him with it again. He did not go inside. He backed out of the driveway without turning on the headlights, drove 3 blocks to the empty parking lot of Greater Emmanuel Baptist Church, and sat there with the engine running and his forehead pressed against the steering wheel until his breathing steadied. Then he cried, not the restrained, jaw-clenched way he had learned to cry after his mother's funeral 15 years ago. This was the kind of crying that comes when a man realizes he has been building a case against the one person who was trying, in the most misguided and heartbreaking way possible, to save him. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, tap subscribe. Stories like this, the ones that crack you open and slowly put you back together, are exactly what this channel was built for. Now, back to that parking lot in Lithonia. To understand how Jerome Hadley ended up in a church parking lot at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, crying over a separation agreement he had been ready to deliver, you have to go back 11 months, to the last evening that felt normal. It was a Friday in June. Jerome had just completed the largest contract of his career, a full electrical retrofit of a 72-unit apartment complex in East Point. The kind of job that puts a small business on the map. His crew had finished 2 weeks ahead of schedule, and the developer had already called about a second project. Sabrina had made his favorite dinner that night: blackened catfish, collard greens with smoked turkey, and the jalapeno cornbread she only made for celebrations. Their son, Darius, 14 years old and already taller than both of them, had spent the evening showing Jerome a highlight reel he had edited of his own basketball footage, narrating each clip with the absolute confidence of a teenager who believes the world is paying attention. It was a good night. The kind of night that makes a man think the hard part is behind him. 2 weeks later, Sabrina changed. The goodbye kiss disappeared first. She used to walk him to the door every morning, coffee in one hand, the other hand on his chest, and kiss him like she meant it. Then one morning, she was already in the shower when he left. The next morning, the same. By the third morning, he stopped waiting. Then the guest room. She moved a pillow and a blanket in there on a Wednesday night and said she had been tossing and turning and didn't want to keep him up. He accepted it. He was working 12-hour days on the new contract. He needed the sleep, but the distance kept growing. She flinched when he touched her shoulder. She carried her phone like a secret, screen always face down, conversations ending the moment he entered the room. She started wearing long sleeves in July, in Georgia. He noticed. He said nothing. One evening, Darius found Jerome eating dinner alone at the kitchen table. The boy stood in the doorway with his basketball under one arm and watched his father for a moment. "Dad, is Mom okay?" Jerome looked up. "She's fine, Dee. Just tired from work. She doesn't seem fine." The words hung there. Jerome pulled his son into a side hug. "I know. I'm working on it." But he wasn't working on it. He was watching it. The way he watched a circuit he suspected was faulty but hadn't tested yet, because some part of him was afraid of what the meter would read. Let's step outside the story for a moment, because what Jerome was experiencing has a clinical name in psychology. It is called anticipatory grief, a concept most people associate with terminal illness, but which researchers have increasingly documented in relationships as well. It is the mourning of a loss that has not yet occurred. The emotional process of preparing yourself for an ending you believe is inevitable, even when the other person is still standing right in front of you. What makes anticipatory grief so destructive in marriages is that it mimics acceptance. The grieving partner stops fighting, stops asking questions, stops reaching across the bed. From the outside, it looks like resignation or even indifference, but underneath, it is the opposite. It is a person who cares so deeply that the prospect of losing what they have is unbearable, and so they begin to let go early, in small increments, to soften the eventual blow. Jerome had been grieving his marriage for months, not because Sabrina had told him it was over, but because every piece of evidence he could see, the locked doors, the hidden phone calls, the flinching, pointed to the same conclusion. She was done. She was already gone. And rather than confront it directly, he had begun the slow, painful work of detaching. This is where a second pattern enters the picture, one that family therapists call emotional pursuit and withdrawal. One partner, sensing distance, begins to pull back. The other, carrying an enormous secret, interprets that pullback as confirmation of her deepest fear. He is already giving up on me, so she withdraws further. His withdrawal deepens hers. Her withdrawal deepens his. Two people spinning in opposite directions inside the same house, each one's survival mechanism producing the exact wound the other fears most. Neither one of them knew they were in the loop. That is what makes it so quietly devastating. By month 6, Jerome had begun to build theories. The phone calls to Lorraine, the new doctor whose name appeared on insurance statements he found in the recycling bin. The Tuesday and Thursday afternoons when she left the house and returned 3 hours later, looking exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with traffic. He told himself there were 100 explanations. He told himself he trusted his wife. But suspicion, once it takes root in a silent house, does not care what a man tells himself. He called his older brother Franklin on a Saturday morning in January. Franklin pastored a small congregation in Augusta and had the particular steadiness of a man who had spent 30 years listening to other people's pain without flinching. Jerome laid it all out. The distance, the secrecy, the slow erasure of everything that had once made their house feel like a home. Franklin listened all the way through. Then he said, "Have you asked her directly?" "She won't talk to me, Frank. Every time I try, she shuts it down." "Then sit with it a little longer, brother. Pray before you act. Because I have watched more marriages end from assumption than from the thing people were actually afraid of. Jerome had not prayed. He had called a divorce attorney on a Monday morning in March. Not from anger. The anger had burned out somewhere around month 8. What remained was something colder and more exhausting. The weariness of a man who had spent nearly a year knocking on a door that would not open. He met with the attorney twice, asked careful questions about custody arrangements for Darius, divided their assets on paper with the methodical precision he brought to reading blueprints. Fair. Clean. No bitterness. Franklin agreed to help mediate. But before he hung up, he added one thing. Sometimes the thing that looks like betrayal is just fear wearing a mask, Jerome. Make sure you know which one you are looking at before you walk out that door. Jerome had not known. Not then, but now, sitting in that church parking lot with the engine running and his wife's words still echoing in his head. 11 months of suspicion and distance collapsed into something he had no language for. He drove home, parked in the driveway, sat in the truck until well past midnight, listening to the house settle. He heard Sabrina come through the hallway, heard the guest room door close, the shower run, then silence. He went inside, stood outside the guest room door, listened to the slow, labored breathing of a woman who had been fighting a war he knew nothing about. Then he went to the kitchen table and sat there until the sky outside the window turned from black to the pale gray blue of early morning. The following evening, Jerome came home at his usual time. He moved through the house deliberately, cooked dinner himself, grilled chicken, rice, steamed broccoli, the kind of meal Sabrina used to tease him about. You cook like a man who reads the nutrition label before he reads the recipe. After Darius went upstairs, Jerome sat at the kitchen table and waited. Sabrina came through the hallway from the guest room. She moved slowly, deliberately. The careful economy of a person managing pain she did not want anyone to see. She stopped when she saw him sitting there, hands folded, watching her with an expression she had not seen in months. Not anger, not distance, something else entirely. Her hand went to the counter to steady herself. Jerome's voice was quiet, completely level, the voice of a man who had already done his crying somewhere else. I heard your phone call with Lorraine last night. The blood left Sabrina's face. Her knees softened. She gripped the counter with both hands, and for a moment she looked like she might go down. Then she lowered herself into the chair across from him the way a building settles when the last supporting beam has finally given way. The tears came immediately. Not the silent, private tears she had been keeping behind locked doors for 11 months. These were deep, heaving, full-body sobs, the sound of a secret that had grown too heavy to carry one more day. I was diagnosed 11 months ago, she said. Right after your contract came through. Right after everything was finally going right for us. She pressed both hands flat on the table. Systemic lupus. It's attacking my kidneys. I've been on immunosuppressants and steroids since August. That's why the long sleeves. The swelling. The fatigue. The bruising I kept telling you was from bumping into things at the clinic. She looked at her hands. They were trembling. Your mother died of kidney failure, Jerome. You were 23. You sat by her bed for 6 weeks and watched her disappear. I watched what that did to you. I watched you carry that grief for years. I swore to myself I would never be the reason you went through that again. So I decided to handle it alone. Get through the treatment, get stable, and then tell you when I could tell you I was okay, not when I had to tell you I was sick. Let's step outside the story again, because what Sabrina just described is one of the most well-documented and quietly devastating patterns in relationship psychology. Researchers call it protective concealment. It occurs when a person who loves deeply convinces themselves that hiding their suffering is the most loving thing they can do for the people they care about most. From the inside, the logic feels like sacrifice, like nobility, like the purest expression of devotion. But what the research consistently shows is that hidden suffering does not stay hidden. It does not remain contained inside the person carrying it. It changes the temperature of a home. It reshapes the way a person moves through a room, answers a question, responds to touch. The suffering leaks out sideways, disguised as distance, as irritability, as a locked door at night, And the partner left on the outside, unable to name what has changed, but certain that something has, begins to fill the silence with their own explanations. Sabrina hid her illness because she loved Jerome completely, and in doing so she accidentally constructed the very conditions that nearly ended their marriage. Distance, secrecy, suspicion, the slow, corrosive erosion of trust. This is not a character flaw. It is a deeply human response, especially in people who have already witnessed what illness can do to the people they love most. Jerome did not speak for a long time. Then he stood, crossed the kitchen, and wrapped both arms around his wife for the first time in 11 months. She broke against him. Her hands gripped the back of his shirt and held on with the desperate strength of someone who had been bracing herself to lose this and had only just realized she might not have to. They stayed like that for a long time, neither of them speaking, just the sound of two people breathing together in a kitchen that had been silent for almost a year. When she finally steadied, he pulled back and looked at her directly. "What else, Sabrina? What else haven't you told me?" She looked away. "I took out a second mortgage on the house to cover the treatments the insurance wouldn't pay for." A beat of silence. "How much?" $47,000. The number landed in the space between them. $47,000 borrowed against the home he had spent 20 years paying for. The home he had rewired himself the summer they moved in. The home where Darius had taken his first steps in the hallway by the front door. Jerome's hands rested flat on the table. Very still. The stillness of a man exercising a level of self-control that cost him something. Then he picked up his phone and called Franklin. "Brother," he said, and his voice carried everything. "I need you to come down here. Not next week. Now." There was a pause. "What happened?" "Sabrina's been sick almost a year. I didn't know. Nobody told me." Another pause, longer than the first. "Jerome, I need to tell you something before I drive down there, and I need you to hear me all the way through." "Say it." Mama Jean knew. The kitchen went completely still. She's known since September. Sabrina called her the week after the diagnosis, asked her to help keep it quiet, and Mama Jean agreed. Mama Jean, Jerome's 71-year-old mother-in-law, the woman who had treated him like a son since the day he married her daughter, the woman who called him every Sunday morning without fail, who kept a framed photo of Darius on her nightstand, who had sat across from him at Thanksgiving dinner 4 months ago and looked him in the eye and said nothing about any of it. And here is where a third psychological principle steps into this story, one that is just as critical as the others. Family systems therapists call it the conspiracy of silence. When a family faces a serious crisis, particularly one involving illness, shame, or the fear of losing the person who holds the structure together, members will sometimes organize themselves around a shared secret without ever sitting down and formally agreeing to do so. One person decides to protect the most vulnerable member. Another is brought in to absorb part of the weight, then another. And slowly, without any single conversation in which everyone consents, the family assembles itself around a sealed silence. The people inside the circle believe they are doing something loving. They are, in their way, trying to. But every person brought into the secret absorbs a portion of the emotional cost. And every person kept outside, like Jerome, begins to feel the shape of something they cannot see or name. They don't know what is wrong. They only know that something is. And that formless, sourceless anxiety is often more psychologically damaging than the truth itself would have been. Jerome had been the only person in his own family not trusted with the truth about his own family. He drove to Mama Jean's house in Conyers that same night. She opened the door before he knocked. She was already crying. Not the startled tears of someone caught off guard. The slow, steady release of a woman who had known this moment would come and had been bracing for it every day since September. "Come sit down, baby." They sat in her living room, the same couch where he had watched football with her late husband Earl every Thanksgiving for 15 years. She folded her hands in her lap and did not wait for him to begin. "She was terrified you would leave her," Mama Jean said. "Your mother's illness almost destroyed you, Jerome." Sabrina watched that up close. She was there for the worst of it. She held you through those months. And when her own body started failing, the first thing she thought was not about herself. It was about you. She said to me, "Mama, I cannot be the thing that breaks him again." Jerome stared at the carpet, the pattern he had memorized over 2 decades of holiday dinners. "She should have trusted me," he said quietly. "I know that. I told her so. More than once." Mama Jean covered his hand with both of hers. "But love does not always think clearly, baby, especially when it is sitting next to fear." She was fighting for her body and terrified of losing you at the same time. That is a weight no one person should carry alone. "I should have told you myself. I carry that." Then the thought arrived, sudden and cold. "Darius," Jerome said. Mama Jean's eyes dropped. "What does my son know?" "More than he should." Jerome found out the rest that same night. He drove home and went straight to Darius's room. The boy was still awake, sitting on his bed with his headphones around his neck, pretending to scroll through his phone, but clearly waiting for something. The way children wait when they know the house is shifting beneath them. Jerome sat on the edge of the bed. "Talk to me, D," Darius told him in a careful, steady voice. The voice of a 14-year-old boy who has been holding something adult-sized for too long, that he had found out 2 months earlier. He had come home from practice on a Thursday afternoon, let himself in through the garage, and found his mother on the bathroom floor. She had been sick from the medication, shaking. One hand braced against the wall, the other pressed over her mouth, trying not to make a sound. "She looked so scared when she saw me," Darius said. "Not scared like she was in trouble. Scared that I would tell you." "Did she ask you not to?" The boy nodded. "She said you were finally getting the business where you wanted it. She said the best thing I could do for this family was let her handle it." Darius pressed his lips together hard, the gesture of a boy trying very hard to be a man. "I didn't know what to do, Dad. I'm sorry." Jerome pulled his son into his arms. "You don't owe me an apology. Not one word. You hear me? Not one word. You hear me? Not one word." He held Darius until the boy stopped shaking. And sitting there in the dim light of his son's bedroom, Jerome understood the full architecture of what had been built inside this house without his knowledge. An entire family quietly reorganizing itself around a single act of protection. Each person carrying a piece of the weight, each one, out of love and out of fear, cutting him off from the very people he would have moved heaven and earth to support. He went to the guest room. Sabrina was sitting up in bed, waiting. She had heard the truck come and go. Jerome sat beside her on the edge of the bed. His voice was steady. His eyes were not. "You really believed I was too weak to handle this?" "No, never." She shook her head hard. "I thought you were too good. I knew you would drop everything. I knew you would stop sleeping. I knew you would cancel contracts and sit in waiting rooms and make yourself sick worrying about me the way you did with your mother. And I could not stand the thought of being the reason your life fell apart again. You were protecting me from my own family, Sabrina." She had no answer. Only tears. Then slowly, with the particular shame of revealing the thing she had worked hardest to conceal, she pushed up the sleeves of her shirt. The bruising along her forearms, the swelling in her wrists and knuckles, the butterfly-shaped rash across her cheeks, and the bridge of her nose that she had been covering with makeup every morning for months. "I didn't want you to see me like this," she whispered. "I didn't want you to start looking at me the way people look at someone who is disappearing." Jerome broke. He pulled her close and held her face in both hands and did not try to compose himself. "You are still the strongest woman I have ever known," he said. "Nothing about this changes that. Nothing." Both of them wept, and in that moment, two people releasing every last piece of armor at the same time, something sealed tight for 11 months finally cracked open. Not broken. Released. Here, one final psychological truth becomes visible. Researchers call it the myth of solitary strength, the deeply inherited belief, especially in families shaped by generations of hardship and self-reliance, that showing vulnerability is identical to being weak, that a good wife endures privately, that a good husband absorbs without complaint, that the most loving thing you can do is suffer where no one has to see you do it. Sabrina hid her illness because she feared that being seen as fragile would cost her the marriage. Jerome buried his pain because he believed a provider holds things together without showing the cracks, both of them operating from the same inherited script, both suffering alone for the same reason: love. What finally broke the pattern was not a confrontation or an ultimatum. It was one man sitting on the edge of a guest room bed, watching his wife push up her sleeves and choosing honesty over composure. "I have been afraid for 11 months, he said quietly, "and I didn't know how to tell you." She leaned her forehead against his chest. "Me too," she whispered. "Me too." Then Sabrina's phone rang. She looked at the screen. Her hand went still. "It's Dr. Okafor." Jerome nodded. She answered on speaker. Both of them sat side by side on the edge of the bed and listened. The doctor's voice carried the particular care of someone delivering news they have been waiting to give. "Sabrina, I have your latest panel results. Your kidney function has stabilized. The treatment protocol is working. We are not out of the woods entirely, but I am genuinely encouraged. This is the response we were hoping for." Sabrina folded forward, both hands pressed over her mouth, shoulders shaking. Jerome wrapped both arms around her and held on with everything he had. After a long moment, she lifted her face. "I had a plan," she said softly. "If the numbers came back good, I was going to tell you everything and ask if we could start over. Do it right this time." He looked at her in the pale light of the guest room. "Then, that is exactly what we are going to do. Stay right here, because the healing this family builds in the months ahead will restore your faith in the kind of love that holds quietly and never lets go." They talked through the rest of the night, not the guarded, measured kind of talking they had been doing for nearly a year, where every sentence was delivered with one eye on the door. This was the other kind. The kind that happens when everything is already out in the open and there is nothing left to protect. Sabrina told him about the morning she first noticed the joint pain, about the weeks of tests, about sitting in Dr. Okafor's office alone when the rheumatologist explained what systemic lupus does to the body over time, about driving home afterward and pulling into the garage and sitting in the car for 45 minutes because she did not yet know how to walk into her own house carrying what she had just been told. She told him she had called Lorraine first because Lorraine was a nurse and would understand the clinical reality without falling apart. She had called Mama Jean second because Mama Jean had buried a husband and knew how to absorb grief without letting it take her under. "Why not me?" Jerome asked. The question was not an accusation. It was searching. "Because with Lorraine and Mama Jean, I could fall apart and then put myself back together before anyone saw me the next morning," Sabrina said. "But with you, I was afraid that if I came undone in front of you, I would never be able to reassemble myself. Because watching you carry that pain would hurt me worse than the disease itself. I know that does not make logical sense." "It makes sense," he said. "That does not mean it was right, but it makes sense." He told her in return what the past 11 months had looked like from his side. He did not spare the details, the suspicion, the phone logs, the attorney, the separation agreement sitting in the manila envelope in his truck. He watched her face as he spoke, and he let her feel the full weight of it, not to punish her, because she deserved to know the cost of the silence, the same way he now knew the cost of hers. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, very softly, "There were weeks I almost left you myself." He looked at her. "I thought about writing you a letter and disappearing, going to Lorraine's in Macon and letting you think whatever you needed to think, because I thought he is already building his explanation for why this marriage ended. And maybe the most merciful thing I can do is let him believe whatever version hurts least." A pause. "But I could not leave, because I still loved you too much, and I was terrified that if I told you the truth, you would stay out of obligation, not love. And I could not survive a marriage held together by pity. Two people, the same house, the same wound approached from opposite directions. both so devoted to protecting the other that they had nearly destroyed the very thing they were fighting to save. The next morning, Jerome stood at the kitchen counter. Sabrina stood in the hallway. Darius sat at the table with his cereal, watching both of his parents with the careful, attentive eyes of a boy who has been reading the weather in this house for months. Jerome picked up the manila envelope, held it up long enough for both of them to see. Then he tore it in half, and in half again and again, until the pieces were too small to hold and he let them fall into the trash can under the sink. Darius was out of his chair before the last piece hit the bottom. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and threw his arms around both parents at once. A 14-year-old boy who had been holding his breath for weeks, exhaling completely for the first time. The 3 of them stood there in a tangle of arms and tears and the smell of morning coffee, holding each other with the uncomplicated fierceness of people who have just been reminded, sharply and clearly, how close they came to losing this. "Our house feels like a home again," Darius said into the middle of it, muffled but perfectly clear. Sabrina laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the first one Jerome had heard in almost a year. He held them both, looked at the ceiling, and said nothing out loud, just gratitude, offered silently to whatever had kept this family standing long enough to reach this moment. A week later, Jerome organized a gathering at Greater Emmanuel Baptist Church, where Franklin had driven down from Augusta to lead a prayer service for healing and restoration. Standing before the congregation, most of whom had watched the Hadley family grow up inside these walls, Jerome spoke honestly for the first time about what the past 11 months had truly been. "I almost walked away from my family," he said, "because I stopped asking. I built my entire career on tracing problems to their source, finding where the current stopped flowing and fixing it. And I let the most important circuit in my life go dark for 11 months without once picking up the meter and testing it." He paused. "From now on, we carry every burden together. No more suffering in separate rooms. No more protecting each other with silence." Sabrina sat in the front pew, tears running freely. Darius sat pressed against her side, watching his father at the microphone with the expression of a boy who is seeing the man he wants to become. Mama Jean was at the end of the row in her Sunday hat, working through her second tissue. Lorraine had driven up from Macon and had stopped trying to compose herself entirely. Franklin prayed over them with the warmth and precision of a man who loves the specific people he is praying for. He thanked God for the stabilized numbers, for the marriage that held, for a son who had carried more than a child should ever carry, and for parents who were now committed to making sure he never had to do that alone again. The congregation said amen in the way that means we have been pulling for you this entire time. What happened in that church represents something family psychology rarely gets to document cleanly. A family moving from crisis into genuine restoration. The shift began when shame was replaced by shared accountability, not blame, shared accountability. Blame looks backward and assigns fault. Shared accountability looks forward and asks, how do we carry this together from here? What Jerome modeled publicly, acknowledging his own role in the silence, his own failure to press past assumption into honest conversation, gave Sabrina permission to do the same, and what she did, allowing herself to be fully seen, gave Darius permission to finally set down the weight he had been carrying in secret for months. Healing does not look like a moment. It looks like a season. It looks like a dinner table that is full again, like a phone that rings and gets answered on the first try, like a woman who comes through the front door at 6 in the evening with her coat still on and kisses her husband in the kitchen before she puts down her bag, like a man who goes to bed beside his wife instead of lying awake in the living room, running numbers on everything that is broken. Like small things returned. Over the weeks that followed, Jerome refinanced the second mortgage at a lower rate, quietly and without ceremony, and set up a payment plan that cleared the medical debt within a manageable timeline. He did not discuss it at the dinner table. He did not make Sabrina feel small about it. He simply handled it and moved forward, the way a man handles things he considers part of his responsibility. He also drove Sabrina to every appointment for the next 3 months. She resisted at first. She had been managing alone for so long that independence had become its own form of armor. But Jerome made his case over 2 evenings of quiet conversation, not with pressure, with honesty. I want to be in the room when the doctor talks to you. I want to hear the numbers myself. That is all I am asking. She agreed. The first time Jerome sat in Dr. Okafor's office beside his wife, holding her hand while the rheumatologist reviewed her latest blood work, Sabrina looked at him sideways and whispered, "You are taking notes." He held up his phone. He had been typing the medical terminology into a notes app so he could look it up later. She shook her head and almost smiled. "You are going to become an expert in autoimmune disease by August. That is the plan," he said. Together, they began couples counseling with Franklin, not because the marriage was still in crisis, but because they had both learned, at considerable cost, that love is not self-maintaining. It requires the daily willingness to tell the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable, especially when silence feels easier. Franklin offered them, session by session, not a set of rules but a language, a way of saying, "I am scared and I am overwhelmed and I need you here," without those words feeling like failure. For two people raised in traditions of quiet endurance, Jerome in the tradition of the provider who holds things together without showing strain, Sabrina in the tradition of the caregiver who gives everything and asks for nothing in return. Learning to receive turned out to be the hardest and most important work of all. They invited Lorraine and Mama Jean back to regular family dinners. Those first gatherings carried an awkwardness that no one tried to pretend away. There were conversations that took courage to begin, but they began them, and slowly, carefully, difficult conversations became opportunities for repair instead of blame. The table got louder. The laughter came back. Darius started doing his homework at the kitchen counter again, the way he had when he was small, just to be near people. True forgiveness is not the erasure of pain. It is not performing cheerfulness over the top of unprocessed hurt. It is the decision to rebuild trust while fully acknowledging the damage. To say this happened, it cost us something real, and I am choosing to move forward with you anyway. Couples who survive serious crises do so not because the pain disappears. They survive because both people make a sustained, daily commitment to transparency, to telling the truth even when it is uncomfortable, to letting themselves be fully seen by the person they have most wanted to hide from. What Jerome and Sabrina were learning, slowly, imperfectly, with occasional setbacks and the occasional laughter at the setbacks, was not how to return to what they had been before. They were learning how to become something more honest, more resilient, closer to the kind of marriage both of them had always wanted but never quite known how to build. The fault lines that Jerome had once feared would bring the whole structure down had become, with patience and proper repair, the strongest points in the foundation. He understood this as an electrician. A joint that has been opened, inspected, and resoldered with full knowledge of where the failure occurred carries current more reliably than one that was never tested at all. Their marriage was like that now. Tested. Repaired. Carrying current again. 5 months after that night in the truck, on a clear Saturday evening in October when the sweet gum trees along the back fence had gone gold and red, Jerome and Sabrina Hadley stood in the backyard of their home in Lithonia and renewed their vows. It was a small, unhurried ceremony. Only the people who mattered most, Franklin presided, his voice carrying the specific warmth of a man officiating something he believes in down to his bones. Mama Jean had been at the house since morning, directing flowers and overseeing the food with the quiet authority of a woman who considers the hosting of significant occasions a sacred obligation. Lorraine had arrived early and cried twice before the ceremony started and made no effort to stop. Darius stood beside his mother in a navy blazer he had picked himself, holding the rings with the serious attention of someone who understood exactly what they represented. Not just this evening. Every evening it had cost to get here. The October light came in low and golden, the way it does in Georgia when the season is turning, making everything look like something worth remembering, even while it is still happening. Jerome held his wife's hands under that golden light. The swelling in her knuckles had gone down. The butterfly rash had faded. She looked tired and beautiful and entirely present. He looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "I used to think you had stopped loving me," he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were bright. "Now I understand that you loved me so completely you were willing to carry all of it alone. The fear, the treatments, the debt. All of it. Just to keep me standing. I am asking you right here in front of everyone who has ever loved us to never do that again. Whatever comes next, we carry it together. That is the only wiring I trust." Sabrina smiled through her tears. She had been crying since he started speaking and had no plans to stop. "Thank you for listening," she whispered, "and thank you for staying." Darius cheered loud enough for the block to hear. Mama Jean had the amen going before Franklin finished the blessing. Lorraine had found the tissue packet she had borrowed from Mama Jean at the church service months earlier and was putting it to full use. The disease was managed. The marriage had held. The cracks that had once seemed fatal had become, in every way that mattered, part of a stronger and more honest foundation than the one they had started with. But just when life had settled into something warm and whole, when the dinners were loud and the guest room had been converted back into a home office, and Sabrina had taken to leaving a second cup of coffee on the counter every morning because she knew Jerome would be up before her, his phone buzzed one evening. He was on the living room couch. Sabrina's head rested on his shoulder. The television was on low. She was almost asleep. It had been a long, ordinary, good day, the kind he had stopped believing was possible somewhere around month 5 of the silence. He glanced at the screen. A no number. A text message. "Jerome, you still don't know everything about those 11 months. It wasn't just Sabrina's illness. There is a bigger secret your family has been keeping from you." He read it once. Then again. He set the phone down slowly on the cushion beside him. Sabrina stirred at the change in his posture. She lifted her head and looked at him and found an expression she had not seen on his face in months. Calm. Still. Reading. "What is it?" she asked softly. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he picked up the phone and let her read the screen. She read it. Her face was still. Her hand, resting in his, tightened slightly. Her smile, when it came, arrived just a half-second too late. Jerome turned off the screen. He did not set the phone down. He sat very quietly in the warm lamplight of the living room they had almost lost, in the house they had almost left, beside the woman he had almost walked away from, and he thought about circuits, about current, about the difference between a connection that has been properly restored and one that has merely been taped over. He held her hand, and he wondered. This story reminds us that the most dangerous silence in a marriage is not the silence born of indifference. It is the silence born of love, the kind that means to protect but ends up isolating, the kind that says, "I am carrying this so you don't have to," when what love actually needs to say is, "I am carrying this and I need you beside me." We have watched the good men in our lives, our husbands, our brothers, our fathers, carry burdens in quiet that would have broken them if someone had not finally said, "You do not have to hold this alone." And we have watched strong women bear their hardest seasons in private, convinced that asking for help was the same as giving something up. Jerome and Sabrina remind us that real love is not the absence of fear. It is the choice to speak through it, to say "I am scared and I am here" in the same breath, to build your foundation not around the cracks, but through them, with honesty and patience and the willingness to let yourself be fully seen by the one person who matters most. And if someone in your life has gone quiet in a way that worries you, a wife, a husband, a son, a daughter, a friend, let this story be the reason you reach out tonight. Because sometimes the most loving thing we can do for the people we love is simply refuse to let them disappear into their own silence.